Last week, investigative reporter and co-author of the Twitter Files, Michael Shellenberger, provided further testimony alleging that social media platforms conspired with politicians and government agencies to not only engage in mass censorship efforts, but also intentionally spread disinformation to influence elections. On Friday, Shellenberger informed the US House weaponization of the federal government hearing that the extent of censorship efforts was more severe than even he initially thought.
9 months ago, I testified and provided evidence to the subcommittee about the existence of a censorship industrial complex, a network of government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, government contractors, and big tech media platforms that conspired to censor ordinary Americans and elected officials alike for holding disfavored views. I regret to inform the subcommittee today that the scope, power, and law-breaking of the censorship industrial complex are even worse than we had realized back in March. Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and other big tech companies are privately owned, people point out, and free to censor content. And government officials are free to point out wrong information, they argue. But the First Amendment prohibits the government from abridging freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has ruled that the government may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. And there's now a large body of evidence proving that the government did precisely that. What's more, the whistleblower who delivered the CTIL files to us says that its leader, a quote-unquote former British intelligence analyst, was quote-unquote in the room at the Obama White House in 2017 when she received the instructions to create a counter-disinformation project to, quote, stop a repeat of 2016.
Joining me now is Michael Shellenberger himself. Michael, you recently co-published a new bombshell report called the CTIL Files, which exposed the extent of this mass online censorship operation. Tell me a little bit about that, and tell me about how the government is using psychological operations and disinformation tactics against their own citizens.
Sure. Well, it's good to be with you, Rita. Good to see you. Yeah, this was very shocking. This was a large trove of documents, a complete set of documents provided to us by a patriotic whistleblower who had access to them. They show that there was much more going on than we thought. It covers a period of time that we had not had a good picture of, which was 2019, 2020. The whistleblower also said that the leader of this organization, it's sort of a supposedly grassroots organization. In truth, they were UK and US military contractors, had started a censorship effort that they tried to hide as a cybersecurity program. They were partly doing cybersecurity, and then they hid within it a censorship initiative. And we know that the person that was in charge of it, according to the whistleblower, said that the idea had come out of the Obama White House in early 2017 before Obama left office. And the idea was not to have a repeat of 2016. We now see other documents showing other government officials working for the government at the time, people working for FBI, people working for the Department of Homeland Security, that were doing the censorship initiative. But it wasn't just that. We actually have a new piece out today that showed that they were actively spreading disinformation. They were doing psychological operations, and that they were considering a much more sweeping program that actually included, and they described in their plans, debanking, which of course we saw Justin Trudeau in Canada use against the truckers. So we're starting to identify what's really a Five Eyes collaboration between the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where you see these intelligence and security agencies working together to go from counterterrorism last decade to counter-populism, trying to counteract the supposed threat of populists like we saw with Brexit and the election of Trump in 2016.
They are working against their own people. It's astonishing that they would engage in this sort of behaviour. One thing to suppress and censor the free speech of American citizens, but to also be pushing this propaganda. And it's very successful, isn't it, Michael? There'd be many Americans who even today would believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, that election was somehow fixed.
That's right. So if you look at it's hard to think about because it's complex, but censorship is one thing, and we saw a lot of censorship, and we saw government proxies, government contractors demanding censorship by the social media platforms of often true information of, say, COVID vaccine side effects, or of the lab leak theory of COVID origins, also of disfavored views, including on the radical left, on the right. But then we also see there were these disinformation campaigns, psychological operations aimed at discrediting the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation when it wasn't. It was really what it appeared to be. We also saw the disinformation against Trump as supposedly as a Russian asset. We saw the disinformation campaign against the idea of a lab leak of COVID as though it were a conspiracy theory or somehow a fringe idea, when, of course, it was always a very mainstream idea, because there have been so many lab leaks before that it was always a realistic scientific hypothesis. And in fact, most people in the United States now think that it did come from a lab. So you're seeing, I think at first we all thought this was just kind of the radical left or the woke left engaging in kind of cancel culture, and that's all that this was. But we're seeing very clearly specific people that were working for the U.S. Navy and also for U.S. military contractors at the time engaging in these censorship and disinformation operations. So now there's no missing link. There's no speculation. There's no theorizing. These are the actual facts of a secretive effort to break the law, which is by definition a conspiracy.
Where did this come from? How do we get to this position where you've got these institutions, and not just in the US, but you mentioned also the UK, the Five Eyes, including Australia, where these institutions have been captured by one side of the political spectrum, and they're actively working against their own citizens. They're part of an effort to discredit and sometimes even persecute political opponents.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's clearly all part of a single strategy to basically discredit populists, mostly on the right, but also on the left to some extent, but to discredit populism. And so it is, on the one hand, partisan because, of course, Trump was a Republican, so it manifested as an effort mostly on the left with Democrats. But it's really the foreign policy blob or the establishment. I mean, it was all the never Trumpers are sort of in that same group that saw populism as a threat. They thought Brexit and Trump were consequences of social media. You see them very clearly talking in their own in these messages and in other instances of needing to basically exert control over social media. They felt like they had lost control. And they say, look, after World War II until the rise of social media, the governments could basically control, television, radio. They had this kind of a monopoly control. Social media changed all that. They wanted to get control over social media. But even more than that, I mean, they were just waging psyops. I mean, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's true. It was psychological operations aimed at tricking people's brains. And I know I was a victim of some of it. The Hunter Biden laptop, I mean, sometimes it's very straightforward. You have something that's legitimate, but they literally did pre-bunking before the release of the Hunter Biden laptop. They put out misinformation suggesting that there would be Russian misinformation about Hunter Biden related to Burisma, so that when the actual story broke in the New York Post, people were inclined to disbelieve it, and that's how they were manipulating people's minds.
And there are people who still disbelieve it. Some of them are Democrat lawmakers. We've seen independent analysis by the Washington Post, CBS News, New York Times, and other outlets confirming the authenticity of the laptop's contents. But you still had a Democrat Congressman, Dan Goldman, try to regurgitate to you the baseless claims that the laptop contents could be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or the Russians. Let's have a look.
Are you suggesting the New York Post could participate in a conspiracy to construct the contents of the Hunter Biden laptop?
No, sir. The problem is that hard drives can be manipulated by Rudy Giuliani or Russia.
Well, what's the evidence that happened?
Well, there is actual evidence of it, but the point is it's not the same thing.
There's no evidence for it, so you're engaging in a conspiracy.
I'm glad you agree.
Is it frustrating having to explain things that have already been debunked? We already know that entire effort to discredit the laptop and its contents and the Biden family's dodgy business dealings. We all know what that was now, and you're still facing these questions.
I mean, it's amazing because, of course, the Democrats the whole time were saying, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. And here we're presenting them with files, and it's Twitter files, Facebook files, CTIL, like actual documents, internal documents. And then he goes and presents this wild conspiracy theory for which there has never been any evidence. And there's only been evidence going the other way. I mean, you have to remember when the New York Post published that article, I think it was October 14th of 2020, they provided not only the computer store signature of Hunter Biden on the receipt left at the computer store repair shop that he left the laptop at, and the New York Post published the FBI subpoena for the laptop from him. So we knew right away there was like documentation. In fact, Twitter's own internal staff evaluated the New York Post article, and they said there's no evidence that this was a result of a Russian hack and leak operation. So to have a sitting member of Congress 3 years later, over 3 years later, continue to perpetuate a conspiracy theory without any evidence of that. I mean, he's claimed, oh, there is evidence. No, there wasn't. All he said is, oh, maybe something happened that we don't know about. That is literally the definition of conspiracy theorizing. I mean, it's really, you can't make it up. The Democrats, I think they went too far. I mean, they had just tried to ignore us the entire hearing and talk about Trump. And then Daniel Goldman couldn't help himself. He had to pick a fight with me. But obviously he had nothing. And I just think they get so wrapped up in their own ideology, they don't even know that they're like engaging in that kind of magical thinking anymore.
Now, Michael, you're part of a new documentary called the Censorship Files. Let's have a quick look.
If the Supreme Court says that the government can coerce, pressure, work with tech companies to censor speech, I don't think that the First Amendment has any meaning anymore.
Especially when you have a crisis situation that you need the First Amendment.
The so-called counter-disinformation units have basically become counter-dissent units. The powers of the state and Silicon Valley are merging.
Today, American taxpayers are unwittingly financing the growth and power of a censorship industrial complex.
I saw Martin Kulldorff there, the Harvard infectious disease expert who was silenced, suppressed, defamed also for warning about our COVID response. He's been proven to be 100% right on just about everything. And he was 100% right in that clip we just saw, where he said the First Amendment is most important during a crisis, but it was effectively suspended during COVID.
That's right. I mean, he just makes such a good point, which is that, free speech is not this kind of nice to have thing. Oh, we'll have it when the government decides to have it. No, free speech is in the United States is an inalienable right. It's a fundamental freedom. It's a fundamental human right. And it's not something that you're allowed to suspend when things are difficult. Like that's what we've been seeing the politicians doing every time. They just they want to censor. And so they just find more things that they're going to call a crisis, whether it's COVID or climate change or racism or whatever. They're just going to invent new justifications. And we're having in Ireland, you see in Australia on the indigenous ballot. I mean, they're just going to invent new justifications for censoring people that they don't like. Now, on the one hand, you kind of go, that just looks like wokeism, but really we now know it's part of a much more sophisticated and terrifying governmental, international governmental operation by the military and intelligence and security agencies to try to counter populist voices. And it's just outrageous. It's terrifying. It should infuriate everybody that wants to decide for ourselves. It's not just that our ability to speak for our own voice, Rita, but it's also our right to hear each other. It's my right to hear you. It's our right to have a conversation. The government it's so out of control and inappropriate. This needs to be shut down. It needs to be defunded. There needs to be an investigation across the Five Eyes countries. We do not want the police and these intelligence and security agencies telling us what we can and cannot say online. It has to stop, and we're going to keep the fight going. The documentary is going to come out early next year. I hope people sign up on the list for at X or at Substack, and they'll be the first ones to see it.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for your time today. You are doing such crucial work, and we look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Rita. It's good to be with you.